Hello everyone, Gammon here. With the release of Far From Home, I saw a bunch of discussion online about Spider-Man. Specifically, I saw a lot of people feeling really depressed about Into the Spider-Verse now officially being the worst selling Spider-Man movie. Now, before we explore why that is, why Into the Spider-Verse is the worst selling Spider-Man movie, I want to go over the data just to establish how badly it actually sold, and also to establish why I personally think it really severely underperformed. So if we look at overall global sales of movies in the Spider-Man franchise, at the top we'll be seeing Far From Home, which is quickly closing in on $1 billion, and Into the Spider-Verse is at the very bottom with $375.5 million. To add insult to injury, what most people will consider to be the absolute worst Spider-Man movie ever made, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, is sitting at nearly double of Spider-Verse's box office at $709 million. Now, I just want to say this isn't as bad as it looks. Into the Spider-Verse was probably significantly more successful financially than The Amazing Spider-Man 2. So the things you need to know is that a studio usually spends about the same amount of money to advertise as it does producing a film, and that studios keep between a third to roughly 80% of the ticket price depending on the country and the time the ticket was bought. So in order for us to estimate just how much each movie made to the studio in the box office, we're going to need to double the production budget in order to account for advertising, and then we're going to subtract that from half of the box office, because half of the box office is a good overall guess as to how much money the studio actually got out of ticket sales. Pretty simple, right? So in the case of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, I couldn't actually find the production cost, but we'll be using the production costs of the first movie, The Amazing Spider-Man, as an estimate. Now that was $230 million, we doubled that, and we have $460 million, which is the total studio investment into the movie. Now if we have the $709 million it made globally, we'll be getting about $354.5 million, meaning it's fair to estimate that The Amazing Spider-Man 2 lost about $105.5 million in the box office. Yikes! In contrast, if we do the same with Into the Spider-Verse, we'll find that total studio investment is $180 million, while half the box office is $187.5 million, meaning the movie made about $7.5 million. Now, this is obviously just a gross estimate, it doesn't include merchandising, Blu-ray sales, and other such things, so each movie made more than what we said. What we estimated was just box office sales. However, I feel it's fair to assume that Into the Spider-Verse was significantly more successful financially than the worst Spider-Man movie ever made. And while that's great, this is probably the last good news I'll have in this video, so treasure it. Treasure it and hold it dear to your heart. Because while it wasn't a loss, $7.5 million is pretty low for a Spider-Man movie. It's actually probably fair to say this movie kinda bombed. Even if we don't compare it to other Spider-Man films, but instead compare it to other films Chris Miller and Phil Lord made, these are the guys behind the Spider-Verse and the Lego Movie, we'll find that Into the Spider-Verse comes short. The Lego Movie made $469 million, which is roughly $100 million more than Into the Spider-Verse. This is despite having a much lower production budget, specifically $30 million less. And there's also no ignoring that despite Into the Spider-Verse having a lot going for it, for instance, it was released on the same time Spider-Man had a major part in the MCU in movies like Civil War and Infinity War, it had stellar reviews, it had great audience reception, it had good word of mouth, it had big names attached to it like Mahershala Ali, Chris Miller, and Phil Lord. Less people went to see Into the Spider-Verse than The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which is a bad sequel to a movie most people didn't like and was absolutely destroyed by reviews. So now that we went over the available info and hopefully I explained why I think Into the Spider-Verse significantly underperformed, most of the people I saw talking about this attributed Into the Spider-Verse being dead last on the box office chart and just generally not performing well to it being an animated film, and I just can't really see that. We've already seen other animated films do significantly better than Into the Spider-Verse. We already mentioned the Lego Movie, but even very similar films like The Incredibles, which don't have the strength of the Spider-Man brand attached to them, did significantly better. We are living in a time where animation seems to be surging, with Netflix actively trying to create animated shows for its service, and subscriptions to anime streaming services like Crunchyroll are soaring. So, it being an animated film just doesn't sit well with me as the reason for the film's poor performance. We also can't say it's a bad movie. The reason people didn't go to see the Spider-Verse isn't because of some objective flaw in the storytelling or the visuals. It's beautifully rendered. Admittedly, the low frame rate takes time to get used to, but I really don't think that's the reason. It's got a good story, most of the cast is endearing, and if we look at the critical and audience scores, the movie is clearly well received and well liked. So why is it Into the Spider-Verse underperformed? I think this is the first sign of Marvel fatigue finally taking its toll. The MCU is giant. It has a lot of momentum and a lot of money behind it, and that can drive even a really average movie like Captain Marvel to do extremely well. The MCU is not going to slow down anytime soon, as you can see by Spider-Man Far From Home slowly reaching $1 billion. However, I do think people are starting to get tired of the MCU. With characters you love slowly leaving the MCU or being replaced, and with the constant onslaught of new movies without giving the audience any time to breathe, I think the MCU is finally starting to outstay its welcome. Not to mention, with more and more movies being required to understand what's happening, it makes it harder for new fans to join. Seeing Infinity War and Endgame, for instance, are nearly required if you want to get the full experience out of Far From Home. And in order for you to see and get the full experience out of those two movies, you kinda need to see literally every MCU movie. That puts a lot of burden on the viewer, and that problem is going to get worse and worse the longer the MCU continues. And I think despite not being part of the MCU, Spider-Man being a Marvel character, oddly enough, hurt instead of helped Into the Spider-Verse. This is despite Spider-Man being the strongest brand in comics and one of the most loved characters. This would explain why it sold fewer tickets than the Lego Movie or The Incredibles, who didn't have as much brand recognition, at least not at the time. Now, let me be transparent and say that for me, Marvel fatigue happened years ago. I stopped watching the Marvel films after Civil War, with the only exceptions being the Spider-Man films of Far From Home and Into the Spider-Verse, because I really liked the character. So, this is possibly just me projecting my own feelings. However, if we consider everything we talked about until now, I can't help but think that Into the Spider-Verse is a sign to the eventual collapse of the MCU. Now, this won't happen tomorrow. Like we said, the sheer inertia behind something as big as the Marvel Cinematic Universe means it isn't going to die quickly. But I do think this is the first sign of superhero films in general losing their powers, and not a sign of the movie-going audience rejecting animated films. And I think this is reflected in overall sales of animated movies, like Frozen, like The Incredibles, like the success of The Incredibles 2, and obviously the increased interest in anime and in anime streaming services. So if you are a fan of animation, I really don't think that you should be depressed over Into the Spider-Verse. I honestly think we're probably at the doorstep to a golden age of animation. I could be wrong about this, of course, but this is just a hunch. However, if you are a fan of Marvel or the Marvel Cinematic Universe or superheroes in general, I think Into the Spider-Verse was the beginning of the end. Anyway, that should be enough for now. Thanks for watching.